There are nights when a phone ringing sounds like nothing more than a phone ringing, and then there are nights when the sound cuts through the room like something alive. Something waiting, something that seems to know exactly where you still hurt. This was that kind of night. This was the kind of night that made a man stop breathing for half a second before he even knew why. And tonight's story is about one of those moments, the kind that does not look dramatic from the outside, but can split a life down the middle from the inside. It is about a man who thought he had already survived the worst of what love could do to him, only to find out that sometimes the real test comes after the storm, when the past does not break down the front door, but simply calls your name and waits for you to open it yourself. So before you settle in, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support means a lot to us, and it helps keep us going as we research and share more meaningful stories about the spiritual journey. Ethan Cole was 38 years old, lived alone in a small rental house just outside Dayton, Ohio, and had the kind of face people trusted without realizing why. He was 6 feet tall, broad-shouldered from years of hauling drywall, paint buckets, and lumber at job sites with tired hazel eyes, and the quiet posture of a man who had spent too much of his adult life recovering from things he never talked about in full. His house sat at the end of a narrow road with 2 modest maples out front and a mailbox that leaned a little to the left, like it had finally grown tired of standing up straight. The place was nothing fancy. A gravel driveway, a small porch with 1 loose board, a Ford F-150 parked beside the trash cans. Inside, there was a brown couch he bought secondhand, a lamp with a yellow shade that made every room feel older than it was, and a kitchen that still smelled faintly of coffee no matter how many times he wiped down the counters. It was the kind of house a man moved into when he was trying to start over without making a big speech about starting over. Outside, the weather had turned ugly just after 10. By midnight, the rain was coming down hard enough to blur the backyard fence into a charcoal smear, and the gutters were overflowing in thick silver streams. Wind shoved at the house in restless bursts. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled low and heavy across the flat Ohio dark. Ethan had been sitting in the living room with the TV on mute, a baseball game replay flickering across the screen, though he had not been watching for over an hour. A Bible sat open on the coffee table beside a legal pad with half a grocery list written on it. Eggs, bread, gas bill, call mom. The ordinary little bones of an ordinary American life. He had worked 10 hours that day, finishing a basement remodel for a family in Kettering, then grabbed a burger and fries from a drive-thru on the way home, then called his older sister Rachel to check in on their mother, whose knees had been acting up again. Nothing about the day had suggested that by after midnight he would be sitting perfectly still in the half-dark, staring at one glowing name on his phone like it had risen from the grave. The phone had been on the end table beside him, face down, forgotten for long stretches at a time. Then it vibrated once against the wood. He barely noticed. A few seconds later it lit up and began to ring. Ethan reached over lazily at first, expecting maybe Rachel, maybe a job site emergency, maybe some spam call that had slipped through the blocker. But the second he turned the phone over, his body changed before his thoughts did. His hand froze, his jaw tightened. Something cold and electric moved through his chest. The screen showed a name he had not seen in almost 11 months. Claire. Just Claire. No last name, no heart emoji, no little joke beside it the way people do when love still feels playful. He had deleted everything else, but never changed the contact before telling himself he did not care enough to bother. The rain hammered harder against the windows. The phone kept ringing. Claire Mercer. Ethan stared at it as if the letters themselves might rearrange into something easier to handle. Claire had once been the kind of woman people described as magnetic because they did not know a safer word for what she was. She walked into rooms like she already knew what everyone wanted from her. Tall, sharp-featured, soft voice, dark blonde hair, and a smile that could either warm you or unmake you, depending on which version of her had shown up that day. Ethan had met her 3 years earlier at a church volunteer breakfast where she laughed at one of his dumb jokes about burnt bacon and somehow made him feel in under 10 minutes more seen than he had felt in a decade. At least that was what it had felt like in the beginning. Later, when things turned, he would look back and realize that being deeply seen and being expertly studied were not always the same thing, but that understanding had come late, and it had come with a price. The phone rang and rang. Ethan did not move. His pulse thudded so hard in his neck he could feel it beneath the stubble of his jaw. It was amazing how fast the body could travel backward. 11 months vanished in seconds. Just seeing her name brought back the smell of her jasmine shampoo on his hoodie, the sound of her crying in his truck after a fight, the late-night apologies, the long emotional spirals, the way every serious conversation with her somehow ended with him feeling guilty for things he had not done. It brought back the Saturday he missed his nephew's birthday because Claire said she could not be alone. The Wednesday he left Bible study early because she was having a panic attack, and later found out she had gone to dinner with her ex. The same week, the Sunday morning, she stood outside his church with tears in her eyes and told him, "You're the only person who really stays," and made those words sound like love instead of the warning they were. Ethan had not answered her last call nearly a year ago either. That had been the beginning of the end. 2 days later, she sent a long text about space confusion timing, how she still cared, but needed to figure herself out. A week after that, he heard from a friend that she was already seeing somebody else in Cincinnati. By then, Ethan was too exhausted to even feel properly betrayed. He just felt hollow, like somebody had been renting space inside his peace and had left the walls greasy when they moved out. It had taken him months to admit how much damage had been done, because on paper, nothing about Claire looked dramatic enough to earn the word damage. No police, no broken dishes, no headlines. Just confusion, control emotional weather, 100 small distortions that taught a good man to doubt the sound of his own instincts. After she was gone, his pastor, a kind older man named Daniel, once sat across from him in a diner booth and said, "Some people don't break your life all at once, Ethan. They teach you to help them do it in installments." Ethan had laughed at the time because he did not know what else to do. Now, with Claire's name shining in the dim room like a match held too close to old gasoline, that sentence came back to him with unpleasant clarity. The ringtone stopped. Silence dropped into the room so suddenly it almost roared. Ethan let out a breath he had not realized he was holding, and for one brief second he thought that was it. Just one call, a ghost pressing her hand against the glass and then disappearing into the storm. But then the phone lit again. Not ringing this time. Voicemail. He watched the notification appear, and with it came something stranger than fear. Something heavier and more precise. He could not have explained it in a way that would satisfy a courtroom, a therapist, or even some of his own friends, but he knew with the same deep certainty he had felt only a few times in his life that this was not random. It was not just a woman calling late. It was not just memory tapping on the door. It felt like a test had arrived, dressed as a voice from the past, and somewhere beneath the ache and curiosity and leftover tenderness, another voice, quieter and truer, was already whispering to him in the dark. "Ethan, whatever this is, do not treat it like nothing." He picked up the phone at last, not to answer, but just to hold it. And as thunder moved over the house again like a warning dragging its feet across heaven, he stared at the unopened voicemail and understood that this night had just become about much more than Claire. He sat there for a long time without pressing play with the phone in his hand, and the rain beating on the windows hard enough to make the whole house feel thin. The old instinct was already waking up inside him, that familiar reflex to move toward Claire's need before he had even measured the cost to himself. It had once felt like compassion. That was the dangerous part. Most traps that hold a decent man in place do not announce themselves as traps. They arrive wearing the face of mercy. Concern, second chances, unfinished conversations. Opportunities to be mature. Invitations to prove that your heart is still soft. Ethan knew that now. But knowledge was one thing and nerves were another. His nerves still remembered her. His body still remembered the old assignments. Pick up, calm her down, explain, absorb, stay longer than you should, carry what she drops, clean up what she stirs up, bleed quietly, call it love. He set the phone back on the coffee table and stood up too fast, restless in his own skin. The room had gone stale. He crossed into the kitchen, opened the fridge, stared at half a gallon of milk, a carton of eggs, leftover takeout in a white foam box, then shut it again without taking anything. The clock above the stove read 12:17 a.m. He rubbed a hand over his face and tried to breathe slower. Outside, the storm pushed water down the glass in crooked silver ribbons. The porch light threw a weak amber glow across the yard, catching the rain in flashing slants. Somewhere, a loose branch scraped against the side fence. The whole night felt unsettled, and somehow that matched the inside of him too well. 11 months was enough time for people on the outside to assume you were fine. Ethan had learned that. If you went to work, paid your bills, showed up for church often enough, laughed at the right moments, and did not post anything embarrassing online, most people figured the worst had passed. But recovery, at least the kind he had been living, was quieter and less cinematic than people like to imagine. It was not one dramatic breakthrough followed by sunshine and acoustic guitar music. It was Tuesday evenings when he almost texted her because he was tired. It was standing in the cereal aisle at Kroger and seeing her favorite granola bar and suddenly needing to leave the cart and walk outside. It was hearing someone in church sing too softly into a microphone and remembering the way Claire used to close her eyes during worship. One hand lifted, tears glistening, as if she were the most surrendered woman in Ohio. Then spend the drive home accusing him of withholding emotionally because he had asked a simple question. Healing had not come to Ethan like a flood. It had come like a man learning how to walk on a leg that had once been broken and never set quite right. He poured himself a glass of tap water, drank half, then leaned against the counter with his shoulders hunched. The kitchen light was too bright, so he switched it off and let the room fall back into shadow. In the dimness, he could see his own reflection faintly in the window glass. A broad man in a worn gray t-shirt, dark jeans, work boots, still on, face older than 38 in this light. There were nights lately when he had started to feel almost like himself again. That had surprised him, not a grand, shiny new version, just himself. A man who liked quiet mornings, black coffee, college football, old gospel songs, played low in the truck, and the peace of knowing that if his phone lit up after midnight, it probably had nothing to do with chaos. He had been protecting that fragile peace the way some men protect a small fire in winter, cupping their hands around it and turning their bodies against the wind. His mother used to say back when his father was still alive, and the house he grew up in was full of raised voices and slammed doors, that some people spend half their life trying to get back to the version of themselves they were, before love taught them fear. Ethan understood that sentence now in a way he could not have at 25. He had not grown up around soft, safe love. His father, Rick Cole, had been a hard-working union man who could frame a wall faster than anybody on the block, and then come home and make the entire house hold its breath without saying a word. He was not a monster. Ethan would never tell the story that way, but he was a storm disguised as a provider. If he had a bad day at the plant, everybody else felt it. If money was tight, the air changed. If dinner was late, silence sharpened. Ethan learned early how to read shifts in a room. He learned to anticipate, to smooth things over, to become useful before anybody had to ask. By 14, he could sense anger before it arrived. By 18, he could call it maturity. By 38, he was finally starting to call some of it survival. Maybe that was part of why Claire had gotten in so deep. She had not looked like danger to him. She had looked like someone whose pain he could read. Someone who needed a steady man. Someone whose chaos might settle if she was loved well enough. It took him too long to understand that there are people who do not want your steadiness as much as they want access to it. People who will feed on your patience, your discernment, your willingness to stay in hard conversations until you are left standing in the rubble of a connection that only kept working because you kept surrendering pieces of your own sanity to keep it alive. Claire never screamed the way his father sometimes did. She did something harder to explain. She pulled, she blurred, she wept, she twisted. She made him feel chosen and guilty in the same hour. She knew exactly how to look wounded when she was the one holding the knife. The phone stayed on the coffee table in the other room. And though it was not making a sound, he could feel it from where he stood, the way you can feel a toothache through your whole jaw. He thought about the first time he met Claire. She had been carrying a tray of paper cups filled with orange juice at that church breakfast, smiling at everybody, moving quickly, warm and bright and just disorganized enough to look harmless. "Can you grab that door?" she'd asked him, and he had, and she smiled with that exact combination of gratitude and familiarity that made it feel like they were already halfway into a conversation they had started in another life. Later that morning, she sat beside him at a folding table in the fellowship hall and asked more questions in 15 minutes than most people asked in a year. Not superficial questions either, real ones. Do you always look that serious when people are singing, "What's the hardest year of your life been?" Do you think God ever lets people meet at the wrong time on purpose? He should have noticed how quickly she moved past ordinary boundaries. Instead, he mistook intensity for intimacy. Men like Ethan often do. He walked back into the living room and sat down again, elbows on his knees. The Bible on the table was still open to Proverbs from the morning before, where he had been reading over coffee before work. His eyes dropped to the page almost accidentally, and one line caught him in that irritating way Scripture sometimes did when it stepped between a man and the story he was trying to tell himself. "Guard your heart, for everything you do flows from it." He exhaled through his nose and almost laughed. "Yeah," he muttered into the empty room, "I hear you." But hearing and obeying were not always twins. Sometimes they were cousins who barely spoke. He glanced again at the voicemail notification. One message. 32 seconds. That was all it said. 32 seconds could be nothing. A drunk mistake, a lonely impulse, a crisis, a performance, an apology, a hook with soft feathers wrapped around the barb. It did not help that Ethan was not a cruel man. Even after everything, some part of him still hated the idea of someone being in pain and him refusing to respond. That had always been the doorway. Claire never needed him to be naive. She only needed him to remain compassionate without boundaries. If he had been colder, she would have bounced off him. If he had been selfish, she would have lost interest. It was precisely his loyalty, his patience, his reluctance to abandon hurting people that made him such fertile ground for the kind of bond that drains a man while convincing him he is doing something holy. The TV still flickered silently in the corner. A picture on the screen wound up and through. Some crowd somewhere cheered with no sound. Ethan looked around his small house at the worn couch. The lamp, the stack of unopened mail held down by his truck keys, the denim jacket hanging off the dining chair, and he felt the weight of what he had built since Claire left. It was not glamorous. It was not the kind of life that made people jealous. But it was real. It was calm. He had his job. His sister trusted him. His mother called when she needed help getting to appointments. Pastor Daniel had started letting him help with the men's recovery group on Thursdays, not because Ethan had everything figured out, but because he knew how to sit with another man's mess without trying to perform wisdom. He had started sleeping through most nights. He had stopped scanning grocery store parking lots for Claire's car. He had gone 3 full weeks once without thinking of her at all until a song ruined it. There was dignity in that kind of slow healing. There was holiness in boring peace. And now her name had shown up just after midnight, like a hand reaching out of an old grave asking him to come identify the body. He picked up the phone again. The screen glowed against his hand. One new voicemail. His thumb hovered over it, then stopped. He could feel the old ache, yes, but beneath it now was something sharper, cleaner. Not panic, not desire. A warning, Not loud, not theatrical, just a quiet sense steady as a nail being pressed into wood. Be careful. This is where you used to lose yourself. His thumb stayed over the voicemail long enough for his hand to start aching. That was the strange thing about moments that change you. From the outside, they often look embarrassingly small. A man on a couch, a phone in his hand, rain against the window, no orchestra, no witness, no dramatic speech. Just a private little hinge in the dark and one decision waiting to swing the whole weight of a life one direction or another. Ethan swallowed hard and hit play. For half a second, there was nothing but muffled background noise, the distant hiss of tires on wet pavement, or maybe rain striking a windshield. And then Claire's voice came through the speaker low and softer than he remembered, careful in a way that made his stomach tighten immediately. "Hey, Ethan." A pause. "I know it's late. I know I probably shouldn't be calling." Another pause, longer this time, like she was choosing her words with surgical precision. I don't know. I was driving and I passed that old gas station off Route 35 where we stopped that night after the Christmas service, and it made me think about you." Her voice caught in a way that would have sounded vulnerable to almost anyone else. To Ethan, it sounded rehearsed enough to be dangerous. "I've been meaning to reach out for a while. I just didn't know if I had the right." She let out a breath. "I'm not trying to make your life hard. I need to tell you something. Could you please call me back when you get this?" Then silence, except for the faint rush of the road beneath her tires. The message ended. That was it. 32 seconds. No emergency, no obvious disaster, no coherent explanation, just enough softness to wake the old protector in him, just enough mystery to hook his mind, just enough humility to make him feel cruel for hesitating. Ethan lowered the phone slowly and stared at the dark TV screen where his reflection floated faintly over a frozen image of the pitcher on the mound. "I need to tell you something." He repeated the words under his breath, not because he believed them, but because he already knew how they worked on him. Claire had always been skilled at sentences that felt like invitations to compassion while quietly shifting responsibility onto whoever heard them. If she said she missed him, that was one thing. If she said she needed to tell him something now, he was not just a former boyfriend. Now he was a man holding a piece of information someone might be depending on him to receive. That was how the trap dressed itself. Not as desire, as duty. He leaned back against the couch and closed his eyes. Immediately, memory rose up fast and vivid. Route 35, the gas station, Christmas lights smeared across wet pavement. He had almost forgotten that night, but the second she named the place, it came back with ugly clarity. They had left church late after candlelight service. Claire had cried during Oh Holy Night, clung to his arm all the way to the parking lot, then asked if they could drive around because she was not ready to go home. He bought her hot chocolate at that gas station because the coffee machine was broken. They sat in his truck with the heat blasting while she talked about childhood loneliness and how Christmas always made her feel easily left behind. Ethan had told her quietly and sincerely, "You're not easy to leave." She started crying harder, then kissed him, then told him he was the safest person she had ever known. 2 days later, she disappeared for almost 14 hours without answering a single call or text, then accused him of suffocating her when he asked if everything was okay. That was Claire. Tenderness and confusion in the same wrapping. Intimacy followed by accusation. Need followed by distance. The pattern never arrived naked. It always came dressed in some aching story that made his compassion feel like consent. He opened his eyes and looked again at the voicemail notification as if the words on the screen might reveal a second message beneath the first. But there was only what she had said and what she had not said. That second part mattered. Ethan had learned near the end of their relationship that omissions can control a room just as effectively as confessions. Claire knew how to leave a sentence unfinished so somebody else would rush in to complete it. She knew how to suggest injury without naming it, crisis without defining it, affection without promising it. It let her keep emotional gravity without paying the price of clarity. He had spent too many nights trying to interpret incomplete signals from a woman who always seemed most alive when somebody else was off balance. The house groaned softly as the wind shifted. Ethan stood and paced to the front window, pulling the curtain back with 2 fingers. The street outside was empty, washed in rain and amber light from the lamp on the corner. Across the road, old Mr. Hanley's porch was dark. The whole neighborhood looked buried in sleep. Ethan used to love that feeling, the sense that the world had finally shut up for a few hours and nothing more could be asked of him until morning. Tonight the quiet felt loaded, like the seconds themselves were leaning toward him, waiting to see what kind of man he was now. He thought about texting instead of calling. Something short. "What is it? Are you okay?" That would give him distance. That would let him stay careful. But even as the idea formed, he knew it was not distance at all. It was the first step back into a dance he knew too well. Claire thrived in half-light and delayed responses, in emotional threads stretched over hours. A text would not solve anything. It would reopen contact. It would tell her the line still worked. It would tell her midnight was still a valid time to reach him. And if there was one thing Ethan had been learning slowly and painfully, it was that some boundaries are not really boundaries if they still leave the back gate open. His phone buzzed suddenly in his hand, and his whole body jolted before he looked down. Not Claire. Rachel. He answered immediately. "Hey, did I wake you?" his sister asked. Her voice was sleepy but alert. The voice of a woman who had spent years raising 2 boys and could switch from half asleep to fully operational in less than a second. "No, I'm up." There was a pause. "You sound weird." He almost smiled. Rachel had always cut through him faster than most people. 2 years older, practical, divorced once and done apologizing for surviving it, she had the kind of emotional radar that did not need much evidence. "It's late," he said. "Don't give me that." He could hear sheets shifting on her end. "What happened?" Ethan hesitated, then said it. "Claire called." Silence. Then, "Tonight." "Yeah." "At this hour?" "Yeah." Rachel let out one long exhale that carried all the history she did not need explained. She had never hated Claire in a loud way. Rachel was too smart for that. She had simply distrusted the effect Claire had on him from the beginning. "Did you answer no?" "Good." She left a voicemail. Another pause. "Did you listen to it?" "Yeah." "What did she say?" Ethan stared out at the rain-slick street. "Not much. Said she passed that gas station off 35. Said she thought of me. Said she needs to tell me something." Rachel actually laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Of course she does." He bristled a little despite himself. "You don't know what it is?" "No, but I know her favorite method," Rachel said. "Vague enough to make you feel responsible. Gentle enough to make you question yourself for being cautious. Serious enough to pull you back in." Her voice softened. "Ethan, listen to me. Not every open door is God opening one. Sometimes it's the same old fire finding oxygen." He closed his eyes. Rachel had never been dramatic, which made her clarity harder to dismiss. What if something's actually wrong? Then she can call 911, her pastor, her mother, a friend, a therapist, or literally anybody whose job is still to be in her emotional rotation. You are not her emergency contact. She paused. "Are you sitting down?" "Yeah." "Then stay there." He let out a breath that sounded almost like a laugh, but was not one. "You always make it sound simple." "No," Rachel said gently. "I make it sound plain." "That's different. Simple would be not caring. Plain is caring and still knowing where the line is." The words landed harder than he expected. caring and still knowing where the line is. Ethan pressed his thumb against the edge of the phone. That had been his problem for most of his life. He knew how to care. He did not always know where he ended and somebody else's storm began. Rachel spoke again, quieter now. "You've been getting your peace back. I can hear it when you talk lately. Don't hand the keys to your nervous system back to the person who wrecked the place just because she knocked softly tonight." He stood there with the rain moving down the window in silver threads and felt something inside him shift. Not all the way, not yet, but enough to matter. "Yeah," he said. "Promise me you won't call her tonight." He looked at the dark road, the empty porches, the sleeping neighborhood, his own reflection hovering in the glass like a man meeting himself halfway. "I won't call tonight," he said. Rachel was quiet for a second, as if measuring the wording. "Okay, that's enough for right now. One night at a time." After they hung up, Ethan stayed by the window with the phone in his hand, listening to the rain and the echo of his sister's voice. One night at a time. That was not a grand prophecy. It was not some shining cinematic answer. It was smaller than that, humbler, almost insultingly ordinary. But maybe that was how real rescue often arrived in American lives like his. Not with thunderbolts and choirs, but through a sister in sweatpants whispering truth into the dark from her own bed in another part of town. And yet, even after the call ended, the tension did not leave, because the promise he had made was narrow. He would not call her tonight. Tonight. Morning was still out there waiting. Morning did not come quickly. It came the way hard things often came in Ethan's life, inch by inch, with long stretches of wakefulness in between. After he hung up with Rachel, he turned off the television, switched out the lamp, and let the whole living room fall into darkness except for the dim blue wash of the digital clock on the cable box. Then he sat back down on the couch as if his body still did not trust itself enough to move into the bedroom. The storm kept going for another hour, maybe more. At some point the thunder drifted farther away, but the rain stayed hard and steady, and the house settled into the deep late-night hush that makes every small sound feel personal. A refrigerator motor clicked on. Pipes shifted. Wind rattled something metal in the backyard. Ethan rested his elbows on his knees and stared at the phone face down on the coffee table, not touching it, not fully looking away from it either. He had made a promise, but promises can still leave plenty of room for inner chaos. Not calling Claire that night did not magically deliver peace. It only removed one action from the board. Everything else was still alive. Curiosity, concern, anger, the old ache, the embarrassing pull of unfinished things, the flicker of hope he hated admitting was still somewhere in him even now. Because hope is not always noble. Sometimes hope is just grief wearing makeup, trying to sneak back into the room as optimism. Ethan knew he should go to bed. He knew he had work in the morning. He knew staring at a silent phone after midnight never improved anybody's judgment. But there he was anyway, listening to the kind of thoughts that only grow teeth after dark. Maybe she really had something important to say. Maybe somebody was hurt. Maybe she was sick. Maybe she finally wanted to apologize. Maybe she had found God for real this time. Maybe she had changed. Maybe you owe her one decent conversation. That last one lodged deeper than the others, because guilt had always been Claire's favorite key. Not crude guilt, not obvious guilt, but the kind a sensitive man can generate on his own without much help. Ethan had been carrying responsibility since childhood so long that it sometimes felt holier than rest. He could forgive other people for being limited faster than he could forgive himself for not being endlessly available. It had taken Pastor Daniel nearly a year to convince him that boundaries were not cruelty in a nicer outfit. They were stewardship. A man had no business calling himself compassionate if his compassion only ever flowed one direction until he was empty. At 1:43 a.m., Ethan finally stood up, locked the front door, though it was already locked, checked the back door, though he knew he had checked it earlier. then headed to the bedroom with his phone in his hand. Like a man carrying a fragile explosive, he did not know where to set down. The bedroom was plain. A queen bed with a navy comforter, a chest of drawers, a framed black and white photo of his parents from years before their marriage, hardened into something tense and brittle, and a cheap bedside table with a lamp, a bottle of ibuprofen, and the devotional book his mother had given him last Easter. He placed the phone screen down on the dresser across the room, as if distance measured in feet could weaken something emotional. Then he changed clothes, climbed into bed, and turned out the light. Sleep still did not come. He lay on his back, staring into the dark, one arm over his chest, listening to rainwater drip from the eaves now that the storm had calmed. When he closed his eyes, the past kept assembling itself in little scenes, some sharp as fresh cuts, some faded around the edges, but still dangerous. Claire sitting cross-legged on his kitchen counter, eating takeout noodles straight from the carton, smiling like home. Claire in his truck, crying so hard she could barely breathe, telling him everybody always left. Claire laughing with one hand on his arm after church, introducing him to people as if he was already hers. Claire on his couch, face closed off and cool as winter, telling him he was too intense after 2 straight weeks of demanding his full emotional presence. That was part of what made the relationship so hard to name afterward. The memories did not line up neatly as all bad or all good. The tenderness had been real in moments. The damage had been real too. And when both things are true, the human heart will often volunteer to forget the second one if the first one shows up crying. Around 2:15 he gave up on sleep and reached for the lamp. Light spilled softly across the room. He sat up, ran both hands over his face, and whispered a prayer that barely sounded like one. Lord, I don't want to be stupid. He sat there for a second, then added, and I don't want to be hard either. That was the deeper conflict, really. He was not wrestling with whether Claire had hurt him. That part was settled. He was wrestling with what kind of man he wanted to be now that he had finally admitted it. There were versions of survival that turned people mean, suspicious, armored in all the wrong places. Ethan had seen it happen. Men got used by the wrong woman, betrayed by the wrong friend, manipulated by the wrong family member, and then called their emotional numbness wisdom because it hurt less than staying soft. Ethan did not want that. He did not want to become sarcastic and unreachable, one of those men who turned every deep conversation into a joke and every vulnerable woman into a threat. But he also knew there was another mistake waiting on the opposite side, a fake spirituality that called self-abandonment, forgiveness, and called access grace. Somewhere between bitterness and foolishness, there had to be a clean road. He just was not always sure how to find it in the moment. His eyes fell on the devotional book. He opened it without much thought, more from habit than faith, and the ribbon marker landed in a chapter on discernment. He almost smiled at the lack of subtlety. The page included a short reflection about how peace does not always mean the absence of feeling, but the presence of clarity. That line stayed with him. He had spent years assuming peace meant calm emotions, but maybe that was too shallow. Maybe sometimes peace was the quiet firmness that arrived when illusion began to lose its grip, even if your heart was still trembling while it happened. He shut the book and reached for the phone again before he could talk himself out of it. Not to call, not even to text, just to look. That was how a compromise usually introduced itself in Ethan's life. Just to look, just to see if she texted again, just to check the voicemail one more time, just to make sure he had not missed something important in her tone. He knew the pattern well enough to be ashamed of it while he was doing it. He unlocked the screen. Nothing new, no second voicemail, no text, no follow-up, just that one message still sitting there unchanged. He stared at it, and oddly enough the silence helped. If Claire had been in a real emergency, there would have been another call, a text, something clearer. The absence of urgency began to reveal the shape of the message itself. It was not a cry for help. It was an emotional flare launched into the sky to see whether he would come running. That realization did not make him feel triumphant, It made him feel tired, almost sad. Because once you really see the mechanism, you cannot unsee it. And there is grief in realizing that what once felt like profound connection was sometimes just repeated access to your reflexes. Still, the human mind is crafty when it wants old pain back in familiar packaging. By 6:30 a.m., after a couple hours of broken sleep at most, Ethan was showered, dressed in jeans, boots, and a work hoodie, standing in his kitchen making coffee that tasted stronger than usual because he had misjudged the grounds. The storm had passed. Morning light sat gray and damp over everything outside. The road looked slick. Puddles had formed near the curb. His truck keys were beside the coffee pot. He should have been thinking about the day ahead, the trim work he needed to finish the supply run he might have to make before lunch. Instead, he was replaying the voicemail again in his head now, with all the softness of morning, making his midnight caution feel maybe a little overdramatic. That was another trick he was finally learning to notice. Things that felt obviously dangerous at night could start looking almost innocent by breakfast. Daylight has a way of flattering old temptations, sanding down the sharp edges until they look manageable. He poured coffee into a travel mug and stood at the sink. On the counter behind him, the phone buzzed once with a weather alert. He turned too quickly, annoyed at himself for the little surge of hope and dread it triggered. Just weather. Rain advisory until noon. He almost laughed. Then his eyes landed on the voicemail icon again, and before he could stop himself, he thought, maybe I should at least hear her out. Not get back together. Not open a whole door. Just hear her out. Grown adults can have one conversation. Closure is healthy. Ignoring people forever is childish. That line of reasoning came dressed in maturity, which made it more dangerous than naked longing. He grabbed the mug, his lunch cooler, and his phone, then headed out to the truck. The air outside smelled washed clean cold for spring. Water dripped from the gutters. Across the street, Mr. Hanley was out in a red flannel robe, getting his newspaper off the wet driveway. Ethan gave him a nod. Mr. Hanley lifted 2 fingers in return. Ordinary life. Normal morning. American neighborhood. A man going to work. No music swelling. No voice from heaven. Just a tired contractor stepping into his pickup with too many thoughts and not enough sleep. He started the engine and backed down the gravel drive. The wipers dragged across the windshield in steady rhythm as he pulled onto the road. For the first 10 minutes, he drove in silence, passing strip malls, gas stations, church signs with half-funny slogans, wet school parking lots, and the low, flat landscape he had known all his life. But somewhere between one red light and the next, the temptation stopped looking like temptation and started looking like responsibility again. He could feel it happening. By the time he merged near Route 35, he had already begun negotiating with himself. I won't call her tonight had slowly become, I didn't call her tonight, and that in turn was drifting toward, maybe that was enough. The thought scared him because it felt so reasonable. Then he saw it. The gas station. Same one Claire had named in the voicemail. Off Route 35. Blue awning, cheap coffee, a half-broken air pump by the side lot. Ethan's hands tightened around the steering wheel before he even realized why. Cars moved in and out under the gray morning sky, tires hissing over wet pavement, people beginning their day without the faintest idea that to one man passing by that ordinary patch of asphalt had just become a spiritual pressure point. He could keep driving, he knew that. Instead, with his pulse suddenly climbing, Ethan flicked on his turn signal and eased into the exit lane. The tires hissed over the wet pavement as Ethan pulled beneath the blue awning and parked beside pump number 3. For a second, he just sat there with the engine running, both hands still on the wheel, staring through the windshield at a place that would have looked forgettable to anybody else. The station sat on the edge of the road like 100 other stations across Ohio, a faded ice freezer by the door, a neon open sign humming in the front window, a trash can with the lid half-cocked, a pickup with a ladder rack at the far pump, 2 women in scrubs coming out with coffees and breakfast sandwiches. The air looked cold and thin, the sky still a dull sheet of gray after the night's storm. Nothing about the place suggested revelation, nothing about it looked holy. But Ethan knew better than to assume that the moments that matter most will arrive with better lighting. He shifted into park and turned off the engine. Silence settled inside the cab. He could hear the ticking of cooling metal, the sweep of the wipers, making one last pass before stopping the faint crackle of a country song leaking from the truck in the next lane. He had told himself this was not a big move. Just stopping, just seeing the place, just proving to himself that it had no power. That was the language temptation preferred in grown adults. It did not say, "Here, ruin your peace." It said, "Be reasonable, be mature, get some clarity, touch the edge of the fire so you can prove you are no longer flammable." Ethan killed the radio, leaned back against the seat, and looked at the storefront. He could picture that Christmas night too clearly now. Claire laughing into her paper cup because the hot chocolate was too hot. Christmas music playing low through the speakers outside. Her face lit by dashboard glow as she turned toward him, eyes wet, saying, "I feel like you always know when something's wrong, even before I say it." He had believed that was intimacy. He had not yet learned that some people will praise the very sensitivity they are preparing to exploit. His phone lay face up in the cup holder. One voicemail, no new text, no missed calls. Morning had not brought urgency from Claire. Morning had only brought the opportunity for Ethan to supply his own. He let out a slow breath, opened the truck door, and stepped into the damp morning air. The smell of wet concrete, gasoline, and burnt coffee met him immediately. A gust of wind pushed at his hoodie. He zipped it halfway and walked toward the entrance booths, darkening with water from the pavement. Overhead, a few drops still fell from the awning in irregular taps. Inside the station was warmer than he expected. Too bright, too full of ordinary life. 2 construction guys in neon safety vests stood near the hot rollers, debating whether the taquitos looked safe enough to risk. An older woman in a Dayton Dragon sweatshirt was buying lottery tickets. The cashier, a bored-looking guy in his 20s with neck tattoos and tired eyes, didn't even look up when Ethan came in. He grabbed a black coffee he did not need and stood for a moment beside the cooler of bottled drinks, the refrigerator hum filling the space around him. That was when he felt the strange split inside himself sharpen. On one level, he was just a working man at a gas station before job hours, coffee in hand, rainwater drying on his boots. On another, he could feel something invisible pressing hard against his judgment. Not supernatural in the theatrical sense. No cold chill, no weird sign on the wall, no mystic symbol in the foam of his coffee. It was subtler than that. It felt like pressure on old wiring, like a familiar current trying to run through circuits he had spent 11 months repairing. He carried the coffee to the register, paid, and stepped back outside. He did not get in the truck right away. Instead, he stood under the awning near the trash can, one hand around the paper cup, the other buried in his hoodie pocket, looking across the lot at the side road where he and Claire had once parked to talk. The memory arrived whole. Her voice, her tears, the way she had leaned her head against the window and whispered, "I don't know why I feel safe with you when I never feel safe with anybody." Ethan had taken those words into himself like a vow. For months afterward, he had lived as though it were his duty to prove they were true. That was the part nobody really talked about when men like him tried to recover. People understood being cheated on. They understood being dumped. They even understood toxic relationships if you gave them the broad outlines. But this thing had been trickier because the deepest wound was not only what Claire had done. It was the way Ethan had slowly been trained to confuse his usefulness with his worth. He was not just grieving her. He was grieving the role he had played in his own undoing, the exhausting holiness he had imagined in constantly rescuing somebody who kept moving the emergency. A white SUV rolled in beside the air pump. A mother got out with 2 elementary school kids in the back, both of them whining about something before school. One of them dropped a juice box on the pavement and burst into tears like the world had ended. The mother sighed, bent down, wiped it off, and handed it back through the window. Ethan watched the scene and felt the ache of ordinary life all around him. That was what made these moments so deceptive. Spiritual tests in real American lives do not always happen on mountaintops. Sometimes they happen next to an air machine at a gas station while a stranger wipes off a juice box and a man in work boots tries not to answer a ghost. His phone vibrated. He looked down so fast the coffee nearly spilled over his hand. A text. Not Claire. Pastor Daniel. You on your way to work? Got a weird question for you if you have a minute later. Ethan almost laughed out loud from the sheer release of it. Then he felt embarrassed at how tense he had been. He typed back, "Yeah, at a stop right now." "What's up?" The answer came within seconds. "Nothing huge, just thinking about Thursday group. Had a line on my heart this morning. Peace isn't proven by what you can endure. It's proven by what you no longer volunteer for. Thought of you for some reason." Ethan stared at the screen. For some reason. He looked up across the gas station lot as the wind moved wrappers near the curb and the gray light settled over everything flat and unspectacular. It would have been easy to dismiss the timing as coincidence. A pastor texts. A memory surfaces. A man feels emotional. But Ethan had lived long enough with God to know that some mornings the help comes in ways too plain to flatter your drama. A sister at midnight, a pastor before 8. Not because heaven is always loud, but because heaven often insists on being practical before it is poetic. He typed back nothing for a moment. Then, needed that. Thanks. He put the phone away and took a sip of coffee that was hotter than he expected. The burn grounded him. He walked a few steps toward the side lot, toward the exact stretch of pavement where he and Claire had once sat talking in his truck, while he mistook her intensity for truth. The old longing brushed against him, then not romantic exactly, but emotional, like grief trying to put on Claire's perfume so it could get through the door. He pictured calling her. He could almost hear how it would start. Hey, thanks for calling back. How are you?" "I've been better." Then the pause. Then the soft sadness. Then the carefully chosen detail, then the subtle opening, then the emotional hook disguised as honesty, then the slow drift away from clarity and into weather. It would not explode. That was the lie. It would not look catastrophic. It would just begin. And beginning was enough. He stopped walking. That thought landed so cleanly he felt it all the way down to his spine. It would just begin. That was how nearly all the damage in that relationship had happened. Not in obvious disasters, but in beginnings he told himself were harmless. One call, one ride, one long conversation because she sounded fragile. One dinner to get closure. One prayer together because she was really trying. One small reopening after another, until the boundary line was no longer a line at all, but a memory. He stood in the wet morning air and finally let himself say the hard truth plainly. The truth he had been circling since midnight without fully admitting it. Claire's message was not powerful because it was urgent. It was powerful because it knew where his tenderness still lived. It had reached for the part of him that would rather risk himself than risk feeling unkind. And if he called her back this morning, it would not be because he lacked information. It would be because some part of him still wanted to believe he could walk back into the lion's mouth and call it ministry. His jaw tightened. He looked again at the side road, then at the phone in his pocket, then at the cloud-heavy sky above the station. There was no lightning bolt, no heavenly chorus, just a clean, unwelcome clarity rising where confusion had been. And sometimes, clarity feels less like relief than humiliation because it shows you how many excuses you were about to make 5 minutes earlier. A pickup pulled in fast from the road and stopped crooked near the diesel pump. The driver jumped out, cursing into his Bluetooth headset about invoices and late deliveries. Ordinary life kept moving. Ethan could hear trucks on the highway, a siren far off, the station door chime each time somebody went in or out. Everything around him said, "Keep moving, keep going, choose your day." His phone buzzed again. This time it was Claire. Not a call, a text. "You got my message? I know you did." Then a second bubble appeared almost immediately. "Please don't do this. Not again." Ethan felt the old internal lurch, that sick mix of anger, guilt, and reflex. There it was. No longer mystery. No longer softness alone. Now the pressure. Now the implication that silence itself was harm. Now the reshaping of reality into a story where his boundary became cruelty and her intrusion became need. He stared at the text until the screen dimmed in his hand. The door he had almost opened was no longer abstract. It was right there, warm and familiar, and expertly disguised. All he had to do was answer. And for one terrifying second, standing beneath that gas station awning with rainwater still dripping from the roof, Ethan almost did. His thumb moved before his wisdom did. Not enough to send anything, not enough to betray the promise entirely, but enough to wake the screen open, the message thread, and place him one breath away from stepping back into the same old current. The blinking cursor appeared at the bottom of the phone like a dare. He stared at it. Rainwater dripped from the edge of the awning beside him in slow, heavy taps. Cars moved through the station in short, practical motions. Somebody laughed near pump 6. The country station inside the store shifted from one song to another. And there, in the middle of all that ordinary motion, Ethan felt the whole battle narrow down to one indecently small thing, a blank text field, and the old hunger to fill it. His mind started writing for him before he had chosen a word. "What do you need? What are you talking about? I'm at work. This isn't a good time. Are you okay?" Even now, with his stomach tight and his nerves lit up, every possible response still bent itself toward her needs. Even his caution wanted to be courteous. Even his boundary wanted to explain itself gently enough that she would not feel abandoned. That was when something inside him shifted, not softly this time, but with an almost embarrassing clarity. He saw the mechanism again, really saw it. The whole relationship had trained him to remain accessible to her emotions, no matter what they cost him. Not just when she was kind, not just when she was honest, all the time. Her confusion became his assignment. Her sadness became his summons. Her silence became his problem to solve. Her timing became his burden to honor. And the truly dangerous part was that for a long time he had mistaken that arrangement for love. He lowered the phone. A gust of wind drove mist under the awning and dampened the sleeve of his hoodie. Ethan barely noticed. He was suddenly too aware of something more uncomfortable than temptation. Shame. Not the kind Claire used to trigger in him, not the old, "you are failing me" shame. This was different. Cleaner. It was the shame of realizing how quickly, even now, he had been willing to hand over the center of himself because someone from the past sounded wounded. He was not ashamed of being compassionate. He was ashamed of how often he had let compassion become permission. The text still glowed on the screen. "Please don't do this. Not again." That line was so familiar, it nearly made him laugh. Not because it was funny, but because it was textbook. Claire had always spoken as if history began at the exact moment it became useful to her. Not again. As if he were the one repeating something cruel. As if silence from him was the pattern worth naming, not intrusion from her. As if his caution had appeared out of nowhere, instead of being built brick by painful brick from every distortion that came before. He thought of the last real argument they had before things ended. Claire had shown up at his house, nearly an hour late, already irritated, already acting as if some invisible injury had happened on the drive over. Ethan had asked carefully whether she still wanted to go with him to his nephew's birthday party or whether he should just head over alone and meet her later. She stared at him for 2 full seconds, then said, "It's wild how fast you make me feel like I'm a problem." He had spent the next hour apologizing for a sentence that in hindsight had been completely ordinary. That was the weather system he had lived under. A reality where her discomfort always outranked his perception, where his tone mattered more than her behavior, where he kept leaving his own ground just to keep the peace and then wondered why his inner life felt like a yard after a flood, all mud and no footing. A minivan rolled past him, slowly, kids loud in the back, a woman at the wheel drinking iced coffee and looking exhausted already. Ethan watched it go and thought with a kind of fierce exhaustion, "I cannot keep calling chaos compassion." The sentence arrived whole. It did not feel clever. It felt necessary. His phone buzzed again. Third message. "I just wanted to tell you the truth." There it was. Another hook. Truth. A word Claire loved when she needed a moral high ground built quickly. Ethan knew that version of her too. The version that suddenly spoke in grave, meaningful language just when she needed to draw him past his defenses. Maybe there was a truth. Maybe there wasn't. But that was not the real issue anymore. The issue was that Claire still believed she could reach into his day, shake his center, and make him reorganize himself around whatever she wanted to release. And the more terrifying discovery was this part of him still wanted to let her. Not because he wanted her back exactly. That was the revelation forming now, sharp and humiliating and freeing all at once. He did not actually want Claire back. He wanted the old ache to mean something better than it had. He wanted all the hours, the patience, the bending, the confusion, the spiritualized self-erasure to resolve into a story with dignity. He wanted to believe there had been something so singular between them that a late-night call almost a year later might still matter in a holy way. He wanted redemption for the pain, and he was in danger of mistaking re-entry for redemption. That was when the deeper lie finally showed its face. It was not just that Claire knew how to sound vulnerable. It was not just that Ethan still had soft places. It was this somewhere down deep he had spent years confusing being needed with being chosen. The insight landed so hard, he actually took a step back. Being needed had always lit something up in him. It had started long before Claire. In childhood, usefulness had brought temporary safety. In his family, the one who stayed calm, stayed helpful, stayed available often suffered less fallout. Later in church, being the reliable one earned trust. At work, being the guy who could fix the mess made him valuable. None of those things were evil in themselves. But somewhere along the way, service had quietly fused with identity. If somebody urgently needed him, he mattered. If somebody reached for him in crisis, he was significant. If somebody said, "You're the only one," some ancient part of him stood up straighter, even if the sentence was poison in a prettier cup. Claire had never needed to be his soulmate to keep him bound. She only needed to be his emergency. He felt suddenly vividly sick of that truth. Not sick of her. Sick of himself in it. Sick of how noble he had tried to make it sound. Sick of how often he had called it loyalty when it was really a wounded man trying to earn his right to be cherished by remaining indispensable. Some men chase admiration. Some chase status. Ethan, if he was honest, had too often chased meaning through rescue. That was why her voice had reached him so fast. That was why the gas station, the memories, the guilt, the text messages had all pressed so hard against his chest. This was not just temptation. It was an identity test. Who are you when somebody's pain no longer gets to appoint you? He shut his eyes for a moment, and Pastor Daniel's text rose back up in his mind with unnerving precision. Peace isn't proven by what you can endure. It's proven by what you no longer volunteer for. A laugh broke out of him then, brief and dry and almost angry. "Okay," he said under his breath, standing there under the awning with the phone in his hand. "Okay." He opened the message thread again. His fingers shook a little now, but not from confusion, from decision. He did not type a long explanation. He did not defend himself. He did not ask what she meant. He did not offer concern wrapped in caution. He did not leave a crack in the door and call it wisdom. He typed one sentence. "I'm not the person you call for this anymore." He looked at it for 1 second, felt the old panic rush up at the thought of sending something so clean, so unembroidered, so impossible to misread. Then before the softer, more frightened version of himself could edit it into something more comforting, he hit send. The message went. No thunder, no collapse, no visible miracle. Just a tiny digital whoosh, and with it a strange tearing sensation inside him, painful but right, like a stitch being removed from flesh that had grown around it. He stared at the screen pulse hammering. Then the red receipt appeared, and 3 dots began to dance.